Good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policies Policy Forum, a discussion on moving from war to diplomacy. I'm Dana Stroul, the research director here at the Washington Institute, and I'd like to start off by welcoming our outstanding panel, all featuring Washington Institute expertise. Here in the room, we have Rob Satloff, the Siegel Executive Director of the Washington Institute and the Howard P. Berkowitz Chair of U.S. Middle East Policy. We also have Hanin Ghaddar, the Friedman Senior Fellow in the Washington Institute's Linda and Tony Rubin Program on Arab Politics. Hanin is an expert in Shia politics, Hezbollah, and Lebanon. And joining us from Israel, Ambassador Mike Herzog, the Tisch Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute, who most recently served as the Israeli ambassador to the United States. Welcome to all of you. Let's get right to it. This is an interesting moment in the Middle East and for the United States. Since October 7, 2023, Israel has been on wartime footing, and the US military has really ramped up our presence, our activities, all both to support Israel and to degrade the ways in which Iran has projected nefarious power across the Middle East for decades. In the past week, we've had the possibility, an opening of opportunity, the potential to transition from military operations to civilian-led processes. And there's been three distinct diplomatic tracks. The first one started last week with the meetings between the United States and Iran in Islamabad after 6 weeks of war. Yesterday, we had a meeting between the Israeli and Lebanese ambassadors here at the State Department under the auspices of Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And of course, for a while now, and with a deadline set for this week, the Trump-endorsed Board of Peace has set a deadline for Hamas to disarm in Gaza. There is no closure on any one of these files. They all remain open today. But a moment of opportunity, and one could argue that the Israeli and American militaries have now set the conditions to hand it over to civilians and transition to political processes and diplomacy. This will take time, patience, and skill. And for that, we have assembled for you a fantastic panel of policy practitioners and experts. So let's get right to it. Rob, can you set the table for us? How did we get here at this moment in time? What are the stakes?
Thank you very much, Dana. Hanin, Mike, it's good to be on a panel with you. This is a very revealing week, as you just pointed out. We have three different types of diplomacy that are going on. We'll say more about this later, but it's useful to point out that we have the highest level ever of the United States engaging with Iran in 47 years of the Islamic Republic. Vice President of the United States speaking directly to an Iranian counterpart. We have in Gaza the Trump administration's novel innovation of the Board of Peace. And we are seeing how that is playing out. And then we have a good old-fashioned State Department-led, face-to-face, U.S. auspices discussion here in Washington. It's a throwback to something that we haven't seen in quite a long time. So just the contrast is fascinating, and I know we'll go into it. But the stakes, I think, the cumulative stakes are unusually high. Not necessarily that they will be defined this week, but the stakes are very high. I mean, when you think about it, in Iran, the near-term stakes concern one of the most important interests that the United States has had for the last 250 years. I mean, our first war was fought against the Barbary pirates for freedom of navigation, and we are still defending the international right for freedom of navigation that is a part of what is happening today. We have been trying to stop the Iranians' pursuit of a nuclear weapon for more than 30 years. And that is at a stage of discussion that is when you combine the military with the diplomatic, an unprecedented stage of discussion. So the stakes on those two issues are huge. Then you have other just near-term stakes between war and peace in Lebanon and Gaza. We could go back to war on both in Gaza, and we could have an even broader confrontation possibly in Lebanon. With Lebanon, the potential for separating Lebanon fully and completely from the Iran conflict is huge. And those are just the near-term strategic stakes. Then, of course, we have huge political stakes here in the United States. We have the future of the MAGA movement, the impact on the U.S. economy. We have the impact on the politics of the U.S.-Israel relationship, which is taking disturbing directions as a result of all this. And of course, the midterm elections. The world is watching all of this because there's impacts on every front. Our Gulf Arab friends, our European friends, our Asian friends, even our adversaries, they're all eager to see how we work ourselves out of the jam, especially in Iran. So the stakes for these diplomacies collectively are really big.
Thanks for that. We're going to go out to Mike in Israel. Rob just painted a picture of how high the stakes are for the United States, for long-standing interests all the way back to the Barbary Pirates, to a decades-long recent policy for Iran to deny Iran a pathway to a nuclear weapon. Mike, can you paint us the stakes from the Israeli point of view?
Yes, thank you. And I'm very happy to share the panel with my colleagues. We are talking here about transitioning from war to diplomacy. And while we witness very important diplomatic measures, as Rob pointed out, there's no full transition from war to diplomacy. In all cases, in Iran, in Lebanon, and in Gaza, we're kind of hanging in between the two, where on the one hand, it is very hard to achieve a deal in all of them. And on the other hand, it's not trivial to go back to full war, certainly not in Gaza and in Iran. Lebanon may be an exception because we started direct discussions between Israel and Lebanon while we're still fighting and while we still have 5 divisions fighting in southern Lebanon. Why are we in this situation, kind of hanging between war and diplomacy, and why is diplomacy so difficult? I think Rob was right in saying the stakes are high, but the challenge is also very significant. For one thing, both the United States and Israel set a very high bar to diplomacy. And these bars meet defiant actors in Iran, in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and in Hamas. When it comes to Iran, we both said we want to basically deny Iran the ability to have an active nuclear program, which would become a military program. Israel also is very much focused on the ballistic missile program, would like to see severe limitations on both range and numbers. When it comes to Gaza, we both said we want to disarm Hamas completely, including light weapons, and remove it from power. And when it comes to Lebanon, Israel's goal is to disarm Lebanon, Hezbollah, and marginalize it. In all cases, Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas are defiant. They say we will not disarm. They are playing on their asymmetric advantages. They are stubborn. For them, survival, it's about their survival, and survival is victory. They have a high threshold of pain, and they believe, some of them, maybe Iran, that time is on their side. The second reason why diplomacy is difficult is, as I said, going back to full-scale war is not trivial. I don't see appetite in the United States to resume the full-scale war with Iran. When it comes to Gaza, given Hamas's position on disarmament, will the United States give Israel green light to resume fighting against Hamas remains to be seen. Lebanon is different in the sense that we started talking while we're fighting. Israel would like to continue fighting in Lebanon, very much so, because we want to complete the job and not find ourselves fighting every few years. And the public opinion here in Israel is pushing the government to continue in Lebanon, not to stop, not to go for a ceasefire. On the other hand, the chances in Lebanon are higher because Hezbollah is weaker, because its patron is weaker, and for many other reasons. The third reason why diplomacy is so difficult is a change in Israel's national security doctrine after October 7th. Whereas until then, we relied on containment based on deterrence. That failed on October 7th, failed with Hamas, failed with Hezbollah. The new doctrine is when we see emerging threats, we take action, we nip it in its bud. We don't wait, we don't trust anybody. And that mindset makes it much more difficult to go for a diplomatic outcome where there's give and take. You also have to remember this is election year in Israel. And during election year, don't expect the government to make the necessary concessions for a diplomatic outcome. In a way, Israel has been fighting for 2.5 years on numerous fronts. We haven't decided any of them. All of them are open, and in order to close them, we have to debate between military measures and diplomacy. Iran and Gaza are run by the United States. Lebanon, Israel is leading. And in Lebanon, Israel adopted a position of talking and fighting at the same time, negotiations under fire. And if we learned anything, that is that Israel excels in its military operation, but less so when it comes to diplomacy. One final word, zooming into those arenas. On Iran, I would just say that I do see while we're fighting, Israel and the US were almost 100% aligned. But when it comes to a diplomatic era, you already see some gaps. For Israel, there's a big emphasis on regime change in Iran following the war, not during the war. And I believe that for the US government, it is more about behavior change than regime change in Iran. And also, when you go to diplomacy, I think there are some differences between the two parties. In Gaza, which is led by the United States, Mladenov just presented the plan to disarm Hamas, which they rejected. In the meantime, there's no stabilization force, no government in Gaza, nothing. And the question is, if Hamas continues to resist, will the United States unleash Israel militarily? And finally, in Lebanon, I do believe there is an opportunity which we may discuss later, but I must say there's deep skepticism in Israel that the Lebanese government can deliver. And for any diplomatic outcome to succeed, I believe this would require a more proactive US role and regional role, Saudis, maybe others. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So we're going to go to Hanin now, and he repeated an important point that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, which is that what was unique about the Lebanon track is that there was talking while fighting.
Yes.
And given this talking while fighting, it is interesting to me that yet the Iranians who tried to say we won't go to Islamabad if Lebanon is not included in the ceasefire went to Islamabad. And despite the fact that Hezbollah tried to intimidate the government in Beirut, the meeting happened yesterday. So talk to us about your top takeaways from what happened yesterday and what is the path forward here? And do you agree that this one, despite the deep skepticism in Israel, actually holds some promise for a way forward?
Yes, thank you. Very important question. Thank you, Mike and Rob. As you said, this is the main takeaway from the whole thing, and main success, let's say, is that Lebanon is negotiating on behalf of Lebanon, not Iran. And the second important takeaway is that Iran could not hijack Lebanon's decision in its own negotiation. And that's a big deal, simply because not only Hezbollah is weakened in Lebanon, but Iran, in a way, has been weakened. So what really changed here and led to these negotiations are many factors, but one of the main factors here is that the military operations of Hezbollah and the IRGC in Lebanon could not be translated into political power or further political power in Lebanon. Lebanon was able to actually take its own track with the Israelis and decide to have direct negotiations. And it's fascinating that there was zero protest in the street, zero violence. Hezbollah only went to social media and statements with threats, which was very much expected, but everybody was expecting a lot more. And that's only simply because their allies, including their Shia ally Nabih Berri, decided to reconsider his position after what happened last week during the strikes.
We'll talk about this later. What happened last week in the strikes? Why? What is critical about Nabih Berri?
Nabih Berri has been the main hindrance to these direct talks. And the president has expressed his desire for direct negotiations with Israel many times before. This is not the first time. But he was the main hindrance. He really, and nobody wanted to upset him for some reason. Nobody wanted to, do it without his okay. But what happened last week is that there has been a number of Amal neighborhoods in Beirut hit very, very hard. And a number of Amal operatives also killed, which sent a very clear message to Nabih Berri saying, you have to be careful. And then miraculously, not miraculously, obviously, he didn't say anything. This happened, he encouraged it, he supported the negotiations, didn't say a word about it anymore. Well, let's see how this goes, because he's known to be someone who is patient at some points and then comes back to the game. Let's see how it goes. There should be more pressure on him by the US as well, not just by the Israelis, to show him that he's no longer immune for a very long time, not just for this round. The good news about this is that they happened. They were sponsored by the US, which makes it, their success more possible. Both Lebanon and Israel came with different priorities, right? Lebanon wanted ceasefire, Israel wanted disarmament, but they both want peace. So that, I think what happened yesterday is that they both focused on the common goal, which is peace, and decided to talk about the different priorities. So the two goals, disarmament and ceasefire, at the end of the day, they are linked. They sound separate, but they cannot happen without each other. So they have to happen simultaneously. And that's, I think, what moving forward from the first round until the second round, everybody knows that a ceasefire or a pause or whatever you want to call it cannot happen in Lebanon without some kind of disarmament. So they're very much linked. Otherwise, if we don't do this, then this will be another ceasefire and the conflict will be renewed another year or two, and we'll see. The problem here is the bottleneck. The bottleneck really until then is that what is the LAF going to do? The Lebanese Armed Forces, the LAF, will have a big role to play in terms of confidence measure building, focusing on certain areas with a certain time frame to show that Lebanon can do this. And honestly, only the LAF can disarm Hezbollah, and everybody knows it. But the current political decision and the current structure and the current plan is not sufficient anymore. This is where the policy focus should be on where to go from here.
Thank you so much for zeroing in on the disarmament question. So this, and Rob spoke about this too, but we have this moment where one can envision breaking the Iran stranglehold on the region, which it has cultivated through developing partners and proxies in Arab societies that have stalled political processes and held them back from fully embracing their own sovereignty and self-determination. Yet in the case of Gaza with Hamas and in the case of Lebanon with Hezbollah, you have adversaries that despite getting quite degraded at the hands of the Israel Defense Forces, refuse to disarm. So this is a question, I think, about how far can military force take you, and then what you do next. You talked about the Lebanese Armed Forces. Mike talked about the fact that the International Stabilization Force for Gaza has yet to come to fruition. So, Mike, I want to ask you first, when we think about transitioning from war to diplomacy, there's a role for military pressure, but there are things that the military instrument alone cannot achieve. So what, from when your perspective looking at this for the past 2.5 years, how has military pressure worked? What are the limits of what it can do? And what is Israel learning from these experiences of what military pressure can do and when other kinds of tools need to be brought to bear to get these adversaries to disarm?
So, as I pointed out, we've been fighting for 2.5 years, and we have had only one exit in Lebanon in November 24, which hasn't worked. So we're back into fighting. And in Gaza, a US brokered process, which has been stalled and faces a lot of difficulties. I think it's obvious to all of us that you cannot achieve the goal of disarmament only through military means. When it comes to Iran, we have really hit Iran very hard. The US and Israel fighting shoulder to shoulder. In this war, unlike last year's war, we already also dealt with their industrial base. So we really took them back, I believe, years. But now the question is how to translate this into an enduring outcome. And here, by the way, I do see some differences between the US and Israel because Israel, given the fact that the regime is still there, we haven't seen regime change, would like the US to adopt maximalist positions in the negotiations. Israel would like the US to insist on no enrichment in Iran forever, which was the US position before the war. But now, after the war, we see the US talking about 20 years of no enrichment. The Iranians are saying 5 years. So they agreed on the principle, and now they're arguing over the terms, the price, and all that. If you look at Lebanon, I mean, there's a big debate here in Israel over should we define a goal of total disarmament of Hezbollah, which is unrealistic only militarily because it would require conquering the whole of Lebanon. And even then, it would be extremely difficult. We fought 2 years in Gaza and haven't succeeded in that until the US took over. So I think people are coming to realize that it's much more complicated than just in slogans. One more comment on Iran. Assuming we bought a few years, I think the strategic question for us in Israel is how do we best use the time bought by our military achievements? And here I would hope that Israel would focus on several things. One is developing new offensive and defensive capabilities because we might have to use them in the future. Defensively, I would like to see a full-scale defensive laser system that can intercept ballistic missiles. Politically, I think we have a unique opportunity to break through to a regional security architecture, given the fact that all the Gulf states were attacked by Iran and would probably be more willing to cooperate with Israel and the United States on security. And finally, something that's been missing in both US and Israeli policies is a long-term strategy to deepen the divide between the Iranian regime and the Iranian people. I think we will focus on tactics, but not on a long-term strategy, employing all the tools that are available in the policy toolbox.
Thanks, Mike. Rob, over to you for your perspective on this question. For Lebanon, Hanin talked about the Lebanese armed forces and needing to work through them. Mike has put some important tools on the table for future preparedness. And when it comes to Iran, we really need to zero in on, other than military pressure, what is necessary for Hamas disarmament, and what else would you add to the mix? Your thoughts on how much can the US military achieve here, and what can the military instrument not do for each of these cases?
So, in terms of Iran, I think it's important to note that the U.S. military has, by all accounts, performed quite impressively. Precise military missions were executed and fulfilled. If there were gaps between goals, means, and ends, they were largely because of murky and fluid objectives, not because of inability on the part of the military to fulfill them. Take, for example, the goal of degrading Iranian power. It's a pretty broad, murky objective. It certainly happened in any objective sense, but it still left Iran with certain asymmetric capabilities. Even President Trump said, it only takes one mine or the belief that there's a mine to upset traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. So Israel, of course, has the same issue. We've seen great achievements, but yet Hamas is running, 40+% of Gaza, and in Lebanon, Hezbollah has taken a huge battering, but it's not out of business, clearly. So the solution on the two latter cases seems to me is something that we haven't done it well enough on, which is empower the alternative. In Gaza, for example, we don't even talk much about what is needed to empower the political and eventually, in some sense, military alternative, whether it's the technocratic government or the Palestinian Authority, which is hiding above, behind them, gives its blessing but not an active role, and eventually, the training that needs to be done for a local Palestinian police. They're the only people other than the Israelis, that are really going to ever shoot, theoretically, at Hamas, and we are way behind in doing any of that. And in Lebanon, it's a slightly different story, but here it's also the case, having to do with incentives and disincentives that need to be done to the government and the Lebanese armed forces to get them to do what they've, on paper, committed to do, but yet, for various reasons, didn't do. Because, as Mike said, there are limitations to what the Israelis can do in Lebanon. And so there are critical third parties. I'll say a little bit more about that when we talk about it a little bit later in the discussion. On Iran, you asked me about, where does disincentives fit into the U.S. diplomacy on Iran? Look, certainly there are some incentives that we should use. If there is an acceptable nuclear-related agreement, we're going to get rid of our nuclear-related sanctions on Iran. If the Iranians were to do an agreement to suspend or end their support for proxies, which is a very complicated notion, as my colleague Mike Jacobson wrote in a recent Institute publication. But if they were to do that, then we would suspend the terrorist sanctions on Iran. But I think we should not. I think we've entered a different phase in Iran where we have much narrower objectives than when the war started, and where we have shifted the balance to where our military tool can support those objectives in a clearer way. So if the objective has to do with ending Iran's stranglehold on the Strait of Hormuz, we're now playing in our territory. We're great. We are huge. We are the best naval power in the world. We know how to handle this issue. If it's kept narrowly and we're willing to bear a certain amount of pain for a certain amount of time, we will succeed in this. And so I think that we need to keep certain things separate. I don't think, for example, on the nuclear issue, I don't think we know enough yet about what really was on the table. Was it a 20-year offer that at the end of which the Iranians can do anything they want? Or was it a 20-year and then we're going to come back to the table and discuss what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. I don't think we know enough about this. And so I wouldn't jump to conclusions about whether it was a good or bad offer. Plus, one has to factor in, I think, Mike hinted at this, where we think Iran will be in 20 years and what the impact of the popular opposition to the regime will be. If we're quite confident that there will be evolution in Iran, well, then it has a different context. So incentives narrowly defined, yes, but not just to get out of this problem.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a question that we have in the Zoom Q&A, and as a reminder to everybody who is tuning in virtually, use the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question, but it's pursuant to some remarks that Rob just made. So Mike talked about the difference between changing the behavior of the regime and regime change. We're talking about, and you're proposing, Rob, a narrow set of incentives to get the kinds of changes in behavior we want to see on things like the nuclear file, or if there's an objective narrowly defined like freedom of navigation in Strait of Hormuz, we're good at that. And you're right, we don't know what was actually on the table in Islamabad, but we can assume that what the Iranians want is sanctions relief, big sanctions relief. And if there were to be sanctions relief for this regime, one could argue that we're back to the same challenges we've had during the original Iran nuclear agreement, et cetera, which is that sanctions relief and funds are going to this regime who has not fundamentally changed its approach to the region, which re-empowers them to reinvest in the problematic behaviors, whether it's the missile program, the drone program, support for terrorism, et cetera. So can you comment? I'd like to ask you first, if you can respond to this question of where should economic sanctions relief fit in to this discussion? How should that incentive be part of this agreement? And then I was wondering, Hanin, if you could comment on this, if your Hezbollah or other adversaries or proxies that have been supported by Iran and you're looking at this, what are you thinking about in terms of sanctions relief and how the Iranian regime could help you?
So, it's not a cop-out to say that we have certain priorities. If we were to get an agreement that were to end Iran's ambitions to have nuclear enrichment on its soil in perpetuity, I think the United States should be willing to offer some significant sanctions relief to Iran as a result of that. I mean, that's the gold standard, and whatever sanctions relief we might in theory consider for lesser agreements will have to be lesser than that.
Even if that sanctions relief means that it could go back into the proxy network.
So this is where, we have to monitor. The United States has multiple interests. We have to prioritize. If we are able to get I don't know if it's on the table. I would be delighted if it were. If we are able to get the Iranians to sign a verifiable, full IAEA inspected agreement that they will never enrich on their territory in perpetuity, yeah, that's worth something. But I do think, and here I'm going to just take a minute to say this. What is missing in all these negotiations, what is missing is what I would call the phantom third party. In all these negotiations, this is a highly unusual set of negotiations. In each of them, we're missing the phantom third party. In Gaza, we are missing the phantom third party of the Palestinian Authority and the alternative possible leadership. In Iran, we're missing the phantom third party of the people of Iran that were originally critical to President Trump's original outline of aims and objectives. And in Lebanon, in reverse, there's Hezbollah, which is not that we should be negotiating with, but we're trying to put them out of business. And of course, they appropriately weren't at the table yesterday, but that's the goal. There's a third party to each one of these talks. And we need to recognize this phantom third party and make sure that our policy encompasses the interests that we have regarding that third party. So that it is connected to what you've just asked on Iran.
Okay.
Actually, can I build on his phantom third party and adjust the question for you
Sure.
a little bit, and then you
Sure.
can answer however you want.
Yeah.
Okay. So Rob talked about the missing third party of the Iranian people at the table there. In Gaza, it's the Palestinian Authority and Hezbollah for Lebanon, but there's another missing party at every single one of these. Well, you mentioned the Iranian people. There's the Lebanese people. There's Palestinian civilians in Gaza. And at this moment of time, the plight of civilians and the civilian toll in all of these wars hasn't really been a major focus of the high stakes diplomacy. And so could I ask you, Hanin, to center this issue of the plight of civilians and what they might need and the role of civilian needs in incentives, but also disarming these adversaries who are holding back these societies. So Israeli civilians have been terrorized. Palestinian civilians have suffered tremendously. Major population movements inside Lebanon because of the war. Gulf civilians and obviously Iranian civilians, they all deserve more attention, both their needs beyond humanitarian aid and the level of casualties. Can you talk a little bit about their needs? And then I'm going to add one thing on just to make it even more fun for you, which is especially in the context of Gaza and Lebanon, there is a view that there can be no reconstruction without disarmament. What are the risks in such an approach, especially given the dire needs of so many of these civilian populations?
Sure. The civilian, humanitarian issue, the refugees, the displaced is a big deal, right? And the aid, there is some aid coming to Lebanon. The problem is that the government of Lebanon is trying to regain its sovereignty. They have made a lot of decisions. Very few was implemented, including issues on this per se, right? So when I say that, let's start just with the needs of the displaced. They need housing and they need aid, right? The aid, they do have aid coming. However, the government still has to do a lot of measures to make sure that Hezbollah doesn't channel this aid through its own NGOs. And this is not the case today. And this is a big deal. This is what's really one of the problems today is that Hezbollah is channeling still aid coming to Lebanon through its NGOs with the displaced. This is one. Lebanon is still giving money to the Council of the South. The government of Lebanon is still giving money to the Council of the South, which is controlled by Hezbollah and Berri. And none of this money is going to reconstruction or to housing or to aid. So this is a real issue. So if we want to address the needs of the civilians, if we want to address the needs of the displaced per se, we need to address how all this is channeled, which we basically need to address. One, help the Lebanese government really regain its sovereignty in terms of implementing their decisions, not just making the decisions, but also see through it, like when the aid comes from the US or the EU or the Gulf, all of that, there should be a monitoring process, which is not really in place. Of course, it's an emergency. Everybody is like overwhelmed, but this is very, very important. So that's really an issue that I think, like in order to address these people properly, we need to address this Hezbollah issue. And going back to the general, like on the Shia per se, there's never a black and white thing with the Shia, right? Like they shift, come and go depending on the situation. But there's something very big that happened today. Without reconstruction, it's an issue. It's a humanitarian issue. And it's like I am from the south of Lebanon and I see my family, every one of my family actually, not displaced per se, but that's like no one knows when we are going to go back home. And this is a big deal. But at the same time, they all know that reconstruction is not happening before disarmament. What really is at stake here is they know the Shia are really stuck between two issues. Their confidence in Iran and Hezbollah is no longer there, because this time around, this war, they were 100% sure, I don't know why, that Hezbollah is not going to start war with Israel if Iran starts war with Israel. But they did. They started this war with firing six missiles. And the shock that the people had that day when this happened was really shifted their rhetoric. They lost confidence as Hezbollah as a resistance. They lost confidence in Iran because they realized that Hezbollah today is only protecting Iran's interests, not their own interests. And with this whole tragedy that is happening, one thing is also happening is that Hezbollah is losing the Shia, not the government. The people want the government. The problem is two. One is that the government is still weak. They need to, really enforce their decisions. And two, the opposition, the Shia opposition, is still weak. They're divided, they're distracted, they're competing. So we don't know what's going on. So this is really the issue. My own concern in all of this is that Hezbollah is going to try, when we talk about sanctions relief, when we talk about all this, Hezbollah is degraded militarily, and we talked about other means, but Hezbollah is an ecosystem. Its power is threefold. It's military power, it's financial power, and it's political power. Militarily, they have been degraded by the Israelis. Financially, they're hoping that some sanctions relief will benefit them, knowing that actually the people who are managing Hezbollah in Lebanon is not Hezbollah, it's the IRGC. They are managing every part of these power foundations in Lebanon. So any sanctions relief in Iran is going to, like the IRGC benefits, then Hezbollah will definitely benefit because they are the Quds force within the IRGC. So that goes without saying. So they're looking at this, hoping that financially they will maintain their power. Politically, this is where the government has a big role to play. The appointments, the structure of security institutions, cleaning up the security institutions, cleaning up all the appointments that were made that would benefit Hezbollah in customs and in ports and borders control, etc. All of this is where the government of Lebanon comes in and makes sure that that foundation is targeted. Financially, the U.S. has a role to play. There are a lot of channels that Hezbollah is using in order to bring in money. Their allies, including Nabih Berri, is helping with that. So there are certain measures, including sanctions, that can be implemented in order to also target. So everybody has a role to play. The Israelis, militarily, the U.S., and the government in Lebanon has a role to play to mitigate Hezbollah's infiltration of the aid channels and in degrading their powers politically and financially.
Thank you. Mike, we're going to go out to you. I'm going to ask you to briefly respond to some of the points Hanin made in the first half of her remarks. So she said two things, and it would be interesting to hear your perspective on how it applies in the Gaza situation. So the first is whether or not the Shia of Lebanon see Hezbollah as their protector or as a liability. There's been, obviously, over the course of since October 7th, do Palestinian civilians in Gaza support Hamas or blame Hamas? And then she spoke about the need to really monitor the aid flows and the financial flows for humanitarian aid, and at some point reconstruction, to make sure it doesn't benefit Hezbollah. The same thing goes for Hamas. There have been all of these attempts to break Hamas's stranglehold on diverting humanitarian aid, the black market for foodstuffs, things like this. It's not getting a lot of attention right now, but talk to us about, in the Gaza context, what more should Israel be thinking of doing to demonstrate that it wants Hamas to disarm? It is not against all Palestinian civilians. It actually wants a post-Hamas future for Palestinian civilians. And what does Israel need to see or want to see in terms of really monitoring those inflows of aid and reconstruction funds so that it doesn't benefit the wrong people?
So Rob spoke about phantom third party, and when talking about Gaza, he mentioned the Palestinian Authority. I believe that the Palestinian people in Gaza are also a phantom third party or fourth party in this case. And it's been Israel's hope throughout the war that with more pressure on Hamas, the people of Gaza will turn against Hamas. It hasn't happened, but I do believe, based on very close monitoring of what's happening there, that probably the majority of people there are unhappy with Hamas, blame Hamas for starting this war and bringing about this devastation on them. Unlike Lebanon, where you have a state and a sovereign government, you don't have that in Gaza. And you have a government, a Hamas government, now controlling around 47% of the Strip, which both Israel and the United States aim at changing with a new technocratic government. And this is a challenge because it's a process that hasn't really started yet. I think it's easier when talking about preventing a humanitarian crisis because the right now the Board of Peace, the Executive Board, is sending him sufficient humanitarian assistance into Gaza. The problem is that Hamas puts its hands on the aid that goes into its controlled area, and people haven't paid attention because of the war with Iran. But in recent months, Hamas actually strengthened its hold on its controlled area and put its hand on a lot of aid that was going in. The only tool that we, Israel and the United States, have right now, short of unleashing the IDF back into Gaza, is conditioning reconstruction on demilitarization. That principle is agreed between our two governments, with a focus on the extensive tunnel network that Hamas built in Gaza. I mean, they built over 400 miles of tunnels, of terror tunnels, which is why Mladenov, under Israeli urging, in his demilitarization plan, emphasized the dismantling of those tunnels, namely demanded that Hamas hand over concrete maps of the tunnel network and is planning to bring in more engineers and so on to deal with those tunnels as a condition for demilitarization. But what we see in effect is that everything is stalled. As I said, no, the technocratic government hasn't gone into Gaza. People didn't go out from Gaza in order to train and become, security forces inside Gaza. And I think part of it was Israel's insistence that everything has to start with measures towards demilitarization. I do believe that on training people to become a local force, Israel should allow them to go out, vet them, allow them to be trained, and send them back with the technocratic government to start the process.
Thanks, Mike. Rob talked about the phantom third party. I want to return to this question of diplomacy and the art of diplomacy for the final round of questions and comments in this discussion. Because the optics, the structure, the technical preparations are so critical in actually utilizing military conditions being set and moving to sustainable political processes. So Islamabad, very senior delegations, direct negotiations, a really big Iranian delegation, the vice president of the United States sitting for 21 hours. Remarkable. Lebanon, you had the Lebanese prime minister cancel a trip to Washington, D.C., but you did have these two very entrusted ambassadors sit down, and you had the Secretary of State investing his time in hosting these meetings, and they all took a photograph together. There are not photographs of Vice President Vance with the Iranian delegation out of Islamabad. And then for Gaza, The U.S. clearly, as Rob spoke about, the creative Board of Peace construct for Gaza, but the negotiations are being led by Nikolai Mladenov, who is not American, not Palestinian, not Israeli, not of the region. He's leading these negotiations, and he is very focused on all of these details, like the tunnels and the weapons, light versus heavy weapons, as Mike says. What do you make of all of this? Are these the right people, the right constructs, the right processes? All of the tracks are related, but right now they're very separate. Should they stay separate? Should they be more linked? Rob, thoughts on this? Art of diplomacy, way ahead.
So a few thoughts. First of all, in your last question, it is absolutely important that they stay delinked. Yes. One of the great achievements of the United States and of our parties is that we did not succumb to pressure to link Lebanon to Iran. And you know what? It didn't stop the Iranians from talking to J.D. Vance. Actually, the Lebanese, it had a very salutary impact in Lebanon, because even some historically Hezbollah sympathetic people said, well, if Iran can speak to the great Satan, why can't we speak to the lesser Satan, right? So, which is terrific. So linkage, we're on the right path on that. That's point one. Point two, I do think we should be prepared for some surprises, diplomatic surprises. So, for example, in Gaza, we are stuck. I would not be terribly surprised if you take a country like Qatar, which is reportedly shifting its policy in the Gulf because of its reaction to being targeted by Iran, and is, saying nasty things about the Iranians, whether they begin to compensate for that by taking a slightly different position on Gaza. I can imagine the Qataris, for example, waking up one morning, calling Donald Trump and saying, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? We did not sign up for long-term Israeli control of half of Gaza. That's not what you told us would be this ceasefire. So either they get out or we get out, which would raise the tension level of what has been a relatively tension-free for the United States ceasefire in Gaza. It would put it back up on the priority level. I think that sort of thing is eminently possible, and I would not put it aside. I know a third point. You correctly noted 21 hours, J.D. Vance. Let's remember, we are trying to address 47 years here. The idea that we were going to reach a historic agreement on anything is pretty preposterous. It may happen, don't get me wrong, but the presumption should be this is going to take some time. And actually time, I think if we're willing to expend it, time works to our advantage. Actually, you wrote a piece, I'm going to plug you, which suggested give this some more time, which I think is a great idea, because time is going to hurt Iran. Time is something that we could use if we show a little bit of patience. So everybody wants things to happen yesterday, but for this diplomacy to play out in a way that is advantageous for our interests, a little bit of time might be a useful additive. So those are 3 points about where we are in this diplomacy. Needs a bit of time. I think if I could just add one last point, I don't think there's going to be a full shift from war to diplomacy in any of these tracks. There's going to be the military instrument pressure to a certain extent on all of these tracks, even if the goal is to achieve a diplomatic outcome. And I think we should recognize that that's just part of what diplomacy is. It's exerting pressure to achieve a certain outcome. It is ultimately achieved diplomatically, but the military pressure doesn't end when you sit down at the table.
Hanin, I'm going to turn to you now. 2 minutes, thoughts on the art of diplomacy and where we go on the Lebanon track.
Yes. So on Lebanon, I think what happened yesterday is a very good first step. Loaded with a lot of expectations, but also with some challenges. One of them is the LAF's role, what the LAF is going to do next, but also what the Lebanese government is going to do next, and what can Israel also offer while we're doing the negotiations. And I think two things here. One, just to be fast. One, because disarmament and military ceasefire or pause, wherever are very linked, but also very difficult on both parties to give. I think while it would be very interesting to look at how a strategy can be agreed on where disarmament happens on a very small scale with a very clear timeline, and this timeline will be linked also to ceasefire phases. So it's a good compromise to link them, actually, accept that they are linked, but also think about phases, areas, timelines. This is one. Two, I think it is today very important to highlight one of the major issues that actually hinder peace negotiations in Lebanon, help Hezbollah criticize, if you want, these negotiations, is the anti-normalization law that nobody has addressed recently in Lebanon. And I think Lebanon should take this first step of addressing this very old, outdated anti-normalization law as part of, as we go forward with these negotiations. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be very complicated to do this, but everybody has a role to play. And definitely the U.S. now has to, this attention that given by the U.S. by Secretary Rubio has to continue. And continue not just to talk about peace, to talk about all these details and what are the best ways to achieve them.
Thank you. Mike, over to you. At some of these processes, Israel is at the table, and in others, it is offering its opinions, but it is not at the table. Thoughts in response to what you've heard from Mike and from Rob and Hanin in 2 minutes. I think you're muted.
Since Israel is leading the Lebanese file, the US is leading Iran and Gaza, I would like to say a few words about Lebanon, because I think this is a test for policy, if you can integrate military and diplomatic measures. As I mentioned, Israel is highly skeptical because we've seen the Lebanese government not deliver. They kicked out the Iranian ambassador, he's defying them, and there are many other examples. I think the key in the art of diplomacy or the art of policy in Lebanon is the balance of power between Hezbollah on the one hand and the Lebanese government on the other hand. And you need a strategy here to weaken Hezbollah, first of all, through continued military blows, but also politically, internally. I think they are isolated. They should be more weakened by the fact that their patron, Iran, is weakened, and also if you can drive a wedge between Hezbollah and the Shiite community. On the other hand, you have to strengthen the Lebanese government through diplomacy to give it space, not to destroy Lebanese national infrastructure, and to bring about international and regional assistance. And then for all of this to happen and to succeed, you need a US leading role, you need a Saudi role, you need other actors to invest in Lebanon, including to enhance the US monitoring mechanism, which we created after the November 24 ceasefire. I think this is a test case for integrating military measures with diplomacy.
Great. Thanks, Mike. I want to thank all of you for such a substantive conversation and some putting on the table some real meaningful thoughts on both how to utilize this moment of diplomacy, specifically what the art of diplomacy should be and what the incentives and disincentives should be at this moment in time. Thank you to all of you. for joining us for this hour. If you liked what you heard, please read us. Everyone here has been putting out both written products and a lot of content in the media, making recommendations on how to utilize this moment of opportunity and reflecting on what has been achieved and what remains unfinished in dismantling Iran's grip on the region. Please log into our website, the Washington Institute, or washingtoninstitute.org. Please continue to read us, and we will continue to hold policy forums to unpack every aspect of this momentous time in the Middle East. Thank you.